Shabbat Shalom, everyone. It is so good to see you here tonight, and I am so excited to share my experiences from a civil rights trip that I was asked to accompany for our local Jewish Federation last week to Atlanta, Montgomery, Selma, and Birmingham, Alabama. We were 50 people. It was 3 days, 3.5 days, and there were 5 clergy with us. And in the spirit of the extemporaneous nature of those charismatic civil rights leaders, some of the greatest orators of all time, mostly preachers, I'm humbled by the task of speaking to you tonight, and I'm going to try to do so a little bit extemporaneously. This is not something I'm particularly comfortable with, but in the spirit of Martin Luther King, I figure I have to give it a chance. Martin Luther King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech I learned last week was not scripted. It was off the cuff. And of course, the story goes that Coretta Scott King, Martin Luther King's wife, turned to Martin at that podium and said, "Martin, tell them about your dream." And so I'm going to speak to you. I hope Dan's not going to shout out from the what I should talk about, but I'll trust that he won't. We began our journey in Atlanta Sunday morning at the Ebenezer Baptist Church, where Martin Luther King was raised, where his father and grandfather were preachers. And this was, they said, the spiritual home of Dr. Martin Luther King, even though he never served as pastor there. Senator Raphael Warnock, we learned that morning, was preaching, and we were thrilled. He talked so beautifully, charismatically about the state of our country, and used a parable from the New Testament about material possessions, about our responsibility to community, about focusing on we rather than me. We are not what we have or what we do. We are a gift to humanity by living in a space of generosity and with the fullness of our hearts, by being connected and thankful to the source of our lives. In whatever way we think of or know of God, we know that there is a source of life that is greater than just ourselves. The congregation clapped and cheered and sang and held their hands up in the air. And if any of you have ever been in a Black church or a Baptist church, know that this is part of feeling the Spirit of God and community in the room. So many dressed in their Sunday best. The church is a respite, and always has been, of peace and hope and divine inspiration that helps them to keep moving forward even in the toughest of times. That morning, I began to understand the role of the faith community in the fight for civil rights, specifically these churches in Atlanta and Selma and Montgomery and Birmingham, that they were organized, they were inspired and bolstered, strengthened only by their faith. Music was, of course, a major part of that movement. And of course, we all know the beloved songs of the freedom fighters and the civil rights marches. But the people I met, those who were a part of that movement at that time, said that their faith was bolstered by the communal singing, that their faith was strengthened by the power of the human voice singing greater and together. After church in Atlanta, we met with Ambassador Andrew Young. He was on a scooter, and he scooted out into the courtyard and dared us to keep up. He was going like a mile a minute. We sat in a small outdoor theater in the outdoor plaza, and he was absolutely remarkable. He remembered key figures and dates of the civil rights fight, specifically talking about Dr. King's vision of world peace. He spoke about the partnership between the Black community and the Jewish community, remembering his close friendship with Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, and later his daughter, Susanna Heschel, who's now a college professor and activist. The first thing I learned from Ambassador Andrew Young was that Martin Luther King had been planning a huge tourist excursion to Israel and Jordan in 1967. He had registered over 4,000 black tourists from the South and somehow miraculously got the tourist ministries of both Israel and Jordan to work together for the first time ever to both of their financial benefit, of course. Dr. King was convinced that if people could see their commonalities and work together on a project such as this, they could begin to build the bridges of peace. This was a story I never knew before. It would have been the first time that Israel ever worked together with any of its Arab neighbors. The borders of Jordan, as we know in that time, butted up to Israel in Jerusalem, and it was a hotbed of violence. This trip was planned for September of 1967, but the trip was canceled because of the Six-Day War in June of that year. Martin Luther King knew a universal truth, that hatred comes from fear of not knowing or understanding another. He wanted to bring about an age of collaboration that would show this, a bonding of human community. And I can't help but wonder, if he had lived, what more could have been achieved. Before this mission, there was so much that I didn't understand or know about the civil rights movement, so much depth that we gleaned from having the honor of just meeting people face to face who were on the front lines of that fight. And they included preachers and community organizers, but also regular people, white and black people, who simply felt that it was their duty to be a part of the movement. It was organized, but the only way it gained traction is for everyone to understand their human commonalities. Music played a huge part in this movement with the advent of rock and roll, Elvis Presley and other artists gaining popularity. White teenagers had a new window into black culture, and they shared the love of that music. At the same time, television allowed an unfiltered national glimpse into some of the horrors of the Jim Crow laws and segregation. The lynching of Emmett Till, Bloody Sunday, children being attacked by dogs and water hoses in Birmingham. White Northerners, religious leaders, and regular people took buses to the South, much to their own peril. It was thoroughly infested with the influence of the Ku Klux Klan at that time. Fire bombings of black churches was not unlikely or abnormal. But when white Northerners began to see the victims up close of this violence, when they began to see it on TV, which Emmett Till was a big part of, because Emmett Till's mother insisted that his wake be televised. For the first time, all of it in its horror would be seen by Northerners and by people who could see their own children's faces in Emmett Till. Maybe we're missing a little bit of that indignation today, a little bit of that commonality. We witness the horrors of our world, and it registers briefly, but then we're on to the next. There's a great danger of becoming comfortable and complacent with violence. And the success of the civil rights movement only came to pass because enough people of conscience from other places in the country put pressure on the government and local leaders to change. On our trip, we examined the role of the Jewish community in the civil rights movement, which became particularly potent leading up to the adoption of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Up until that time, technically, black people had the right, they were considered full citizens, but voter suppression took place in systematic ways that victimized the black community. Registration and literacy tests for black voters were virtually impossible to pass. These were some of the questions for black voters in Alabama. How deep is the Alabama River? How many jelly beans are in a gallon jar? How many bubbles come from a bottle of dish soap? If an individual, by sheer brilliance or coincidence, was able somehow to pass this absurd standard of testing, they would routinely be blacklisted, unable to secure jobs in their communities. If they dared to register, they were targeted. And in learning this fact, I began to see the historical connection between the disempowerment of black people today in regards to voter suppression that is still alive and well in many states, especially in the South. Jewish involvement in the movement was not as clear-cut or universal that we would like to believe. Yes, many Jews were involved in the forefront, the civil rights movement. Yes, Jews risked their lives. They were in prison alongside black protesters. But support of the civil rights movement was not without its discord in the Jewish community. Many didn't feel it was their place to get involved. Many were scared, and rightfully so, for their own well-being. Jews from the north, it was easier for them. Rabbis came down on buses and were among those arrested in peaceful protest. But many congregations in the South did not have the same outlook. The South was rife with the Klan, local and state leaders who made the lives of any supporters of the movement very difficult. There were Jews on both sides of the civil rights fight, even those in Selma, who aided the Alabama National Guard in rounding up dissidents and stood in staunch support of segregation. Some congregations and rabbis supported the movement. A mentor of Rabbi Jason's, Rabbi Akrish in Montgomery, and you could talk to him more. He's got a lot of stories to tell. He was one of those Southern rabbis who supported in secret. But many were rightfully afraid. In an era of firebombing attacks all throughout the South, they were, after all, living in the wake of the Leo Frank story. An Atlanta businessman, Jewish, framed and imprisoned for murder, finally handed over to an anti-Semitic lynch mob who murdered him in cold blood. The Ku Klux Klan was powerful and feared by the Jews of the South as a very real and present danger. After Atlanta, our next stop was Montgomery. This is where we all perhaps felt the strongest link in the entire story of the Black experience in America. We visited an extraordinary museum tracing the history of the Black experience from 12 million innocent people who were forcibly brought here on slave ships, just showing the way that they were bought and sold, families separated, those who dared to step out of line by questioning a white person or looking in the wrong direction or speaking to a white woman. These people faced absolutely inhumane and brutal consequences well into the 20th century. An outdoor art installation in Montgomery marks the generations of lynching all across the South, really from the mid-Atlantic states, from Pennsylvania to New York to Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Texas, and every state in between that you can think of, and list the names of thousands of individuals lynched, hung, drowned in every county, men, women, and children. The Legacy Museum in Montgomery faces this history, showing the trajectory of Black Americans through slavery, emancipation, forced unpaid labor, Jim Crow, segregation, inequity in education, and mass incarceration of today. It shows a straight line of continuum. To walk the streets of Montgomery is to be aware of every step of that history, from slavery until now. Our hotel was across the street from the Equal Justice Initiative that at one time was a slave warehouse. They would keep the slaves there and march them 2 blocks to the main market square. Rosa Parks' famous groundbreaking ride began at that intersection, facing the place marked as the old marketplace where human beings were bought and sold at auction. This is something else I didn't know. Perhaps you know. Do you know how long Rosa Parks' famous ride lasted that set off the human rights movement, changed the course of history? Neil said very short, very short. Do you know how long? 2 blocks. Rosa Parks was forced off that bus after a 2-block ride and arrested because she wouldn't give up her seat so that a white person could sit down in the designated black section. This began the first major civil rights battle in 1955 and the famous 381-day bus strike in Montgomery. Leaders of the movement knew that economic pressure was a good way to get results. The churches organized an underground taxi service, and all black people found their way around the city and to work through organized ride shares. They would pay what they owed for their rides of the week through the collection basket that was passed around at church on Sunday. The bus company lost $3,000 a day throughout that entire 381-day boycott, which is today's equivalent of $33,000 a day. At that time, Martin Luther King Jr. was just in his late 20s. He was a Baptist minister in Montgomery who endorsed nonviolent civil disobedience. And he emerged first on the scene in Montgomery as a leader of the boycott and was a leader in the negotiations. And at first, they were not even asking for desegregation of the buses. They were simply asking for a designated area in which a black person would not suffer the indignity of being forced to give up their seat if they were sitting in a designated black section. But a Supreme Court ruling on another bus segregation case preempted the final negotiations. Following a November 1956 ruling by the Supreme Court that segregation on public buses was unconstitutional, the bus boycott ended successfully. It had lasted 381 days. Local lore tells that Montgomery and the bus company and certain areas of downtown never fully recovered from those financial losses. And you can see that in the downtown, which on a Monday was eerily quiet, aside from our group of 50 Jews. If only you were a fly on the wall to see almost all of us descend upon a barbecue restaurant for lunch in the middle of this town with several of our clergy wearing kippot, we got some side eyes. I was overcome in Montgomery, though, taking in this hallowed ground, learning the history of the beginning of this freedom fight. And we all know how Rosa Parks played a pivotal role in this fight. But what happened to her after the bus boycott? Rosa Parks and her husband were both ostracized in Montgomery for years. Neither were ever able again to secure a job in Montgomery, Alabama. And finally, they relocated to Michigan, where Rosa Parks died in 2005 in poverty, exiled from her home in Alabama. This recognition forces me to ask the question, how do we as a nation, how did we get here? How could we publicly venerate a hero for so long and let her fall by the wayside to die in poverty? These are just some of the uncomfortable truths we must face in order to do better, in order to make change, and in order to continue to follow in the lead of these historic change makers. After a memorable soul food dinner at Montgomery's famous Martha's Place restaurant, we drove the next morning the hour drive to Selma. The roads outside of Montgomery on the way to Selma are rural and lined with farms. Our tour guide explained that this road was extremely treacherous when not under order of protection or permitted for protest. Ku Klux Klan ruled this territory, We heard the story of so many who joined the fight for voting rights whose names have been largely lost to history or glossed over. Included among them was one woman named Viola Liuzzo. Viola was a white housewife from Detroit who got in her car and drove down to Alabama to help planning of the Civil Rights March from Selma to Montgomery in 1965. One night, while driving a black rider from Montgomery to Selma, she was forced off the road by the Ku Klux Klan and murdered. Her passenger, Leroy Moten, was injured in the attack, but played dead and later fled Selma. He was 19 years old and a witness to an execution-style murder. So he fled for his life, never to return to Alabama. In Selma, we met an extraordinary woman named Linda Blackman Lowry. Remember her name, Linda Blackman Lowry. She was the youngest person ever to join in the fight in the march from Selma to Montgomery, having been badly beaten when she crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge on what came to be known as Bloody Sunday, the first attempt at a peaceful protest from Selma to Montgomery, led by the late Congressman John Lewis. Linda had been in prison 9 times before her 15th birthday, and she told us her story about her mother who had died because she was refused emergency medical services at the closest white-only hospital. This formative experience ignited within her a relentless pursuit of justice. She spoke about Dr. Martin Luther King's concept of steady, loving confrontation. This nonviolent credo became the source of her fight, the rock of her life. She became a leader among the children. This movement of the civil rights movement was a children's movement. They marched for their parents who would face employment consequences if they were protesting or imprisoned. They organized through school and church and signed up for who would be marching and protesting on any given day. Linda spoke about the amazing collaboration and support of the teachers they gave in turning the other way and allowing the kids to leave school, to the brains, so-called brains in the class, the children who stayed to complete the work of the other classmates who missed school in order to march. Linda described the brutality she faced, the fear as she walked over the top of the Edmund Pettus Bridge to see the National Guard and Klansmen blocking at the bottom. The feeling of holy ground under our feet as we walked these steps in silence and sacred remembrance was powerful and palpable. It was right after Linda had told us that she was beaten on that bridge on Bloody Sunday within an inch of her life. The next day, on to Birmingham, we went first to the 16th Street Baptist Church. 4 children died in a bombing there by the Klan in September 1965. As I said before, bombings were not unusual, but this was on a Sunday morning, and 4 children were killed at a time of worship. And in the park across the street, public art installations commemorate the children and the innocents attacked by police dogs and fire hoses when they gathered there. But the most remarkable moment for us in Birmingham was a talk just soaking in the energy of a man named Bishop Calvin Woods. He was recently retired from the Calvary Baptist Church at the ripe or young age of 89. He was the man who drove Martin Luther King to the airport on his final trip to Memphis, where he was assassinated. Bishop Woods told us that he had faith that the only reason he is still alive today is to meet with us at that very moment, to tell us about the struggle, to tell us of the power of faith, the responsibility of action. He sang with us and asked us to join him in song and prayer, which we did, and we sang that song that we all sang before, Woke Up This Morning with My Mind Stayed on Freedom. He spoke about 4,000 black children arrested in Birmingham, of his personal efforts to expunge their records in a lawsuit that he personally brought to the Alabama State Supreme Court. One of the most meaningful things I learned, and certainly a fact that I had not fully understood, was that the civil rights movement could not have achieved its aims without the efforts of the children. This is how the movement was most organized and most effective, when the children were a part, when it was publicized and broadcast in northern suburban wives and mothers saw their own children in the faces of these young innocents, and they were disturbed enough to do something about it. So when we look at Amanda Gorman or Greta Thunberg or David Hogg, our young leaders of today, we know that they stand on the shoulders of all of those who rallied in place of their elders. The voice of this youth movement had tremendous weight and power, and it was fueled by faith and a deep attachment to community, a deep understanding that the well-being of one or lack of respect of one was deeply consequential on all. I also realized that it is easy for us to posit in hindsight where we would stand in those moments of history. I was very aware that while taking selfies on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, I would not face brutality, violence, death, or imprisonment at the bottom of the bridge. We all hope that we would stand on the side of justice. But how do we show that commitment in our lives when it makes us uncomfortable or goes against the grain? When it puts us in a position of having to have difficult conversations? How many of us say we're not going to engage in politics or with those who are different from us? How many of us throw up our hands rather than to look at difficult truths? The civil rights movement is not a thing of the past. It lives on in so many issues of our time. In voter suppression, wealth disparity, education inequity, generational poverty, erosion of reproductive rights, rising white supremacy, discrimination against the LGBTQ community, and the list goes on and on and on. And there is still so much work to be done. We have become oversaturated and more isolated, but we need to return to the mentality of Dr. Martin Luther King, who spoke the most fundamental truth that I can think of. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. When we assume that we are better or more educated or more deserving or look down on another because of their job or their socioeconomic status, their ethnicity, the color of their skin, their religious beliefs, their political inclinations, we lose touch with a little bit of our humanity. And we need to see ourselves in the other. My prayer for us as a Jewish community is that we continue to grow and nurture our own prophetic voice. This is the legacy of our people as a light to the nations. That we approach our challenges with honesty and nuance and civil discourse. As Linda Blackman Lowry of Selma writes in a beautiful memoir that she wrote, "Whatever wrongs you see, you can change with steady, loving confrontation. Don't stop when you are tired and discouraged. Stay determined. Don't give in to the hate. Stay positive. That is the loving part. And stand up to bullying with the power of your people. That is confrontation." We hear from the words of Dr. Martin Luther King.
Dream that My four little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted. And every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is a faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, my country, tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. And so let freedom ring. From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring. From the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania, let freedom ring. From the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, let freedom ring. From the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, and when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Oh, let us turn our thoughts today to Martin Luther King and recognize that there are ties between us, all men and women living on the earth, ties of hope and love, sister and brotherhood, that we are bound together in our desire to see the world become a place in which our children can grow free and strong. We are bound together by the task that stands before us and the road that lies ahead. We are bound and we are bound. There is a feeling like the clenching of a fist. There is a hunger in the center of the chest. There is a passage through the darkness and the mist. Though the body sleeps, the heart will never rest. Shed a little light, oh Lord. Shed a little light, oh Lord. TV screen. No, 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 no. When I open my eyes, I wanna drink my fill from the well on the hill. Do you know what that means?
Shed a little light,
Shed a little light, oh,
so that we can see.
oh yeah.
Just a little light, oh Lord.
Just a little light, oh Lord.
Wanna stand it on up,
Stand it on up, oh
stand it on up, oh Lord.
stand on up, oh.
Wanna walk it on top,
Wanna shed a little
shed a little
light,
light, oh Lord.
oh, shed a little light, oh, shed a little light. There is a feeling like the clenching of a fist. There is a hunger in the center of the chest. There is a passage through the darkness. The body sleeps, the heart will never rest. Oh, let us turn our thoughts today to Martin Luther King and recognize that there are ties between us, all men and women living on the earth, ties of hope and love, sister and brother.
Shabbat Shalom. Many of you understand that Mi Chamocha is our song of deliverance and our song of freedom. And tonight, as we talk about the civil rights movement, we must understand the similarities, the commonalities between our two peoples, that the civil rights movement was a movement bolstered in faith and took that story of the Israelites escaping slavery and coming to freedom with them in their hearts. And so we adapt this evening's Mi Chamocha, as we did last week, to the civil rights song, Woke Up This Morning With My Mind Stayed on Freedom. And what I learned in, if nothing else, in this civil rights movement was that music, faith music in particular, was what roused everyone to action. So I'm going to ask you to join with us. It'll be easy once you learn it. Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai, mi kamocha ne'etzah b'kodesh, mi kamocha nora tehilot u'sefala, mi kamocha who is like you, O Lord. Woke up this morning, everybody. Woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. Woke up this morning with my mind